Hey, thank you, and welcome everyone. Thank you for those who voted. Just to give you an idea, it looks like most of you on the call are brand new to Sumo Logic. A few of you have actually searched some data but never installed. Some of you are number 3, and a very few of you are number 4, which you've installed multiple collectors. So it sounds like most of you are brand spanking new to Sumo Logic, and we'll try to cover the basics here. This is, I must say, this is not necessarily a beginner's webinar, given that installing a collector is an administrative function. It's not necessarily an analyst function. But I think you'll, for everybody here, you'll still get some good knowledge out of this. So a little bit of housekeeping. Let me close this poll for now. A little bit of housekeeping. My name is Mario Sanchez. I run training here at Sumo Logic. And today I'm joined actually by Macy and Ryan, who are part of our engineering team that works specifically on the data collection side. We're going to be having a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. So these two people will be fielding questions specifically for data collection. As you have noticed, everybody on this call is muted, and that's for good reason. We want to avoid distractions. So everybody's muted. However, if you do have any questions, please use the GoToWebinar question panel that you have on the right-hand side. So you can send questions at any time. Both Ryan and Maisie will be picking up those questions, and we'll definitely go through a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. This webinar will be recorded, and I will share with you both the recording along with the slides, especially because some of these slides have links that are pretty interesting for you to follow up on. All right, let's get started. So the completion of this webinar, we hope that you'll be able to, very importantly, design a Sumo Logic deployment that is going to fit your organization. And this is probably where we're going to be spending most of the time. Actually, installing collectors and creating data sources is pretty simple. From a mechanics perspective, is actually pretty straightforward to install a collector and to create data sources. But one of the key things is, how do you design a Sumo Logic deployment that is going to fit your specific organization? So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. And then we'll also cover at a high level how you can do local file configuration management. All right. So since there is a few newbies in the house, I'm going to start with a 30,000-foot view, high-level data flow. How data comes into Sumo Logic is through this area that I've labeled with a 1. It's just data collection, and we do this through a series of collectors and sources that are part of the collectors. Once that data is in Sumo Logic, you can search, you can analyze that data using our operators, you can chart that data, and eventually you can visualize and monitor that data through dashboards, through alerts. But today we're going to be focusing here on this part number 1, how to get the data into Sumo Logic to begin with. How do we ingest that data? All right. So what kind of data can we ingest? Well, we can ingest just about anything. You probably recognize a lot of the labels in here. These are some of the devices, some of the network tools that you might be using, some of the infrastructure stuff that is in place. Tidbit of interesting information, we've actually hired a few people that are coming from these different organizations so that we can enhance our knowledge domain, our expertise domain in these areas. But for example, the stuff on the left-hand side could represent your stack. It goes, starts from the network through your virtual, your operating system, your databases, all the way up to your custom code. So we can pull any information from this, any data from here, whether it's structured or unstructured data, and load it into Sumo Logic. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that data collection for Sumo Logic is infinitely flexible. We are very, very flexible, and that is a plus for us because it allows you to bring just about any data into the system. But it could also be a little bit difficult for you to try to figure out, okay, what's the best option for us in terms of bringing this data? And that's kind of what we want to go through today. We want to help you decide what's the right deployment for you. So if I look first at the top of this diagram here, I'm going to be talking a lot about installed versus hosted collectors. And at a high level, an installed collector is something that you actually, it's an agent that you install in your host systems, like you see down here at the bottom. But a hosted collector is something that, there is no installation. It's a collector that sits in the Sumo Logic cloud. So the top examples here, for example, let's take this Amazon Web Services. So we could do cloud-to-cloud log collection from Amazon for things like ELB, CloudWatch, CloudFront, CloudTrail. bringing data from an S3 bucket, for example. We could also do cloud-to-cloud log collection for things like Akamai CDF. Also, we can get cloud-to-cloud log collection from PaaS platforms and SaaS platforms such as Office 365 or Google through our API. And we can also do client-side logs from mobile applications. And this is essentially doing a post directly over HTTP to the Sumo Logic Cloud. At the bottom of this diagram here, we're looking at examples where we use installed collectors. Let's take this example here, this first three on the right-hand side. In this case, if these servers were to have access directly to the internet, we can install log collectors. This little box here with a plus sign represents a collector, an installed collector. So in this particular case, we can install these collectors on each one of those machines, and they can talk directly to the Sumo Logic Cloud. If you have, let's look at the bottom left-hand side here. If you have machines that do not have internet access, perhaps what you can do is you can forward those messages through something over SSH, for example, a WMI, forward those to a collector that then can send it on to the cloud. And similarly, if you have network devices and firewalls that can send their logs via syslog over to that centralized collector, we can send that over to Sumo Logic. So as you can see, this is just an example of how many different options there are for you to be able to send data to Sumo Logic. So what we're going to try to do today is walk you through the different options. All right, since there's a few new people in the house, what I'm going to start is when you first log on to Sumo Logic, you probably come to a screen like this. To set up your collectors, you go under Manage and you go under Collection. And in my case, I have a few collectors here already set up. This is a training instance that I run. And I have some Artifactory data coming in. So this shows you that I have a collector called Artifactory. And within that collector, I have several sources. I have my Artifactory access data, my request, my server data, and my traffic data. All these are different sources that are coming through this particular collector. And you notice in this case, it's a hosted collector, meaning there's an HTTP post being done by these different sources to get my data over to me. Somewhere down at the bottom, I might have an example of an installed collector. This is an actual agent that sits in my host, in my target host, and the data is coming in. So this screen here under Manage Collection shows you all the collectors and sources that have been set up. If you want to add a new collector, you click on this Add Collector option, and from here you walk through this wizard that shows you how to get an installed collector in place, for example. So if I click on Installed Collector, it's going to give me the options of what operating systems I want to run this on. And once I click on any of these, it will download the right file, and then I can run through the wizard to get those installed. Similarly, if I had clicked on Add Collector and click on Hosted Collector, I would go through this wizard and be able to then, once my hosted collector is in place, start adding sources to that particular collector. In this case, because it's a hosted collector, here are the different options of things I can build off of that hosted collector. All right. So as I said, the mechanics for building these, for installing the collectors are simple. Today, what we're going to talk about is a little more of what's involved with setting up your data, bringing that data into the system, and the different deployments that you can get. So at a high level, customers collect and send data to Sumo Logic through the use of collectors and sources. In this example that you see here, this is a great example of a typical customer. This customer is sending us web server data. Host A and Host B have Apache access data. Host C has IIS logs. And you notice that they're using a combination of installed collectors and hosted collectors. Collector A and Collector B are installed collectors, each in their respective host. Collector C is a hosted collector, so there is some script on host C that is posting or curling data over to Collector C so that we can grab that data. So we're going to start with collectors, and then we're going to dive into how to set up your sources as well. All right, let's begin with collectors. I've talked a little bit about hosted versus installed collectors, and then within installed collectors, there's even additional options that you can do. So let's start with hosted collectors. Essentially, a hosted collector allows for a seamless collection of data from Amazon S3 buckets or any HTTP source. The hosted collector does not require any installation, does not require any activation, and there are no physical requirements, which is great since all this is hosted in AWS. Also, the other things to keep in mind is because there's no performance issues to consider, you can just configure as many S3 and HTTP sources as you like from a single hosted collector. So very, very versatile with very limited requirements for you to take to be considering. From an installed collector perspective, the installed collector is pretty lightweight, it's pretty efficient, and you can choose to install a small number of collectors, like in this case, what we're calling centralized data collection, which I will dive into more detail in a little bit. But you can decide to install just one or very few number of collectors to minimize the maintenance and to keep your topology pretty simple. Or alternatively, you can choose to install many collectors on each one of the different machines. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about each one of these deployments because that way you're distributing the bandwidth or the impact across the bandwidth impact across your network. All right. Your installed collectors are deployed in your environment, either on a local machine, any machine in your organization, or even on an AMI, on an Amazon machine image. So these collectors, of course, as you saw me when I demoed it, they do require a software download and an installation. But keep in mind that upgrades to these collector softwares, upgrades to these collectors are released on a regular basis. Now, here's a couple of things to consider about installed collectors. So if you're going to have a collector on a dedicated machine, again, this is more talking about this centralized data collection, you're going to be running very high bandwidth network with high logging levels through that. So you might consider this if you already have some sort of centralized data collection option. You might consider this option down here at the bottom if you expect the combined number of files coming into one collector to exceed, say, 500 messages, 500 files, or perhaps your hardware has memory or CPU limitations. So we'll talk about these two different options so that you can start making a decision of what makes sense to come up with in terms of your deployment options. All right, I'm going to talk first about the cloud data collection here, and then I'll talk about these two. So from a cloud data collection perspective, most data is going to be generated by your cloud services, and it's going to be collected via Sumo Logic cloud integrations. The source types that we can bring in through this cloud data collection include S3 buckets. So essentially any data that is written into an S3 bucket, it could be through AWS, through Lambda scripts, or your custom apps. We can do HTTPS posts like Akamai, or perhaps you want to put log appender libraries into your actual code. And through the API, we can get data through the API in this log collection. What are the benefits and what are the drawbacks of using the cloud data collection? So the first and foremost benefit is that there's absolutely no software installed. This is pretty straightforward. Some of the drawbacks could be that there might be some S3 latencies issues. There's really nothing we on the Sumo Logic side can do here, but there are some possible latencies here. And the other drawback that might come up is normally with cloud-to-cloud integration, you might want to set up your own caching so that you can do some things like recover when there's a failure. So what are the typical scenarios for this? So this is great for those customers that are completely on AWS, so AWS customers only. Now, while it is possible to rely completely on cloud data collection entirely, that's not necessarily what we see on the field all the time. What we see on the field is that these source types are normally just part of a broader strategy. Okay, from a local data collection perspective, what we see here is that in this particular case, actually let me show you a little picture of this before I actually jump into describing it. But from a local point of view, that means a collector is installed in each one of your target hosts. And now, of course, this requires connectivity from each one of those machines out to the internet so that it can connect with Sumo Logic. So in this particular case, we're sending log data that is produced by those target hosts, and we're sending it directly to the Sumo Logic backend via an HTTPS connection. The source types for that include local files. So for example, your OS, your middleware, any custom apps, any window events, Docker logs and Docker stats, a dedicated collector with syslog stuff. So syslog, whether it's dedicated collector or directly, so your network devices, for example. Or you can also set up scripts. So you could do Cloud API, database content, binary data that you want to send over. Some of the benefits and drawbacks here. So from a local data collector, it's great. There is no additional hardware requirement because you're installing that agent on the host itself. You could do things like automation with a tool like a Chef or a Puppet, so that it becomes a lot easier to manage. Now, from a drawback perspective, and this might be a deal breaker for a lot of you, is that those machines do require outbound internet access. If you're in a situation where you have lockdown and you cannot have internet access on those production machines, then this option will not work for you. And the other drawback is that, of course, there's some resource usage on the target because there is an agent installed. There is a collector installed on that particular machine. What are the typical scenarios that we see here of people using local data collection? So typically we see customers with large amounts of servers, normally very, very similar servers, using some sort of automation to get these collectors installed into those machines. So we see this on-premise data centers, and we see this also on cloud instances. All right, the third option is a centralized data collection. And this is a case where you have a collector installed on a dedicated machine, and then this dedicated machine collects the log from the target host via various remote mechanisms, and it's forwarding the data to the Sumo Logic backend. So let me show you a picture first of what that looks like. In this particular case, I have one collector on this dedicated machine, and I'm having all these different log files or log messages being sent to this central collection area. So the source types we can get there is syslog, again, your OS, your middleware, your custom apps, Windows events like remote Windows events, and scripts as well. Now, benefits and drawbacks from this. The benefit is that you do not need any outbound internet access on your target hosts. If I go back to that particular picture, oops, sorry, it was the other picture, this one in here. These guys in here, which are, say, my production machines, do not need any outbound internet access. Instead, it's only needed by that dedicated hardware that I was talking about. One of the main things that we look for when we recommend this strategy is that we leverage existing login infrastructure. If you do not have a login infrastructure already in place that centralizes your logs, this option is probably not the best one for you. Some of the drawbacks here is that it's harder to scale. Of course, you're going to need some dedicated hardware for this. And from a configuration perspective, there is a little bit more complexity because now you have to account for failovers, you have to set up some syslog rules, and so on. The typical scenarios that we see here is customers with mostly Windows environments. So if that's you, this should be sounding true. If you have a Windows environment and you already have some sort of centralized logging infrastructure in place, like a syslog or a Logstash. And we see this mostly on on-premise data centers. So the reason we're walking through all this for you is because we want to make sure that right from the start, you get an environment that makes sense for you. I've specified here a couple of other resources. I'm going to be sharing these slides for you so you can go and look at a little more detail about designing your deployment, a little more detail about the best practices of local and centralized data collection. But in short, now that I've talked about these three different options, let me tell you that in most cases, our customers will employ a mix of these different options that I've talked about, of these three different options, because they need to account for different limitations on both the log types as well as the source types. Let me give you an example. Network devices only broadcast syslogs, so even if you generally employ the local file collection paradigm, you're still going to need some syslog infrastructure to collect these logs, right? The same would be true for any cloud API log. You may want to collect via script. Another example would be, let's say that you have a customer that is AWS only. So this customer has everything up in AWS. They will most likely still choose to install collectors on all their EC2 instances so that they have local collection for those. And at the same time collect AWS audit logs like CloudTrail, ELB, and all these other ones via the S3 integration. So again, you don't have to commit just to one of them. It's going to depend on what kind of data you have. Which strategy you choose does not depend just on where that data lives, but it really depends on the next three things. One is the sensitivity in terms of the outbound internet access that you have. The second one, and this is very key, is the technical abilities of your team. So setting up a centralized infrastructure does require some sort of knowledge. It requires hardware, and it just requires the need for monitoring, for scaling, and for fault tolerance. So you need to make sure that you have a team that can support that structure. And the third thing is, if you already have a login infrastructure in place, then it's easier to consider this centralized option that I'm talking about here. Really, at a high level, we only recommend this centralized option if, one, you absolutely cannot live with internet access requirements. Two, you have an existing infrastructure already in place. And three, if your volume of, if your data volume or your number of target hosts happens to be pretty large. Otherwise, we normally would be telling you that to go the local route. All right. I'm not seeing any questions coming in, so but if you do, please feel free to send questions, and we'll pick those up at the end of this session. So I talked a little bit about the collectors themselves. Now let's talk about the sources. So if you remember, this is a typical customer in this particular case. This customer has 3 different hosts. These hosts have 3 different collectors. The sources are either the files themselves. So for example, I would have an Apache Access file sitting in this host, and a separate one would be an Apache error file sitting in here. So I could create sources that are individual for these ones that are going to be picked up by this collector. So let's look at sources themselves. Let me actually go into the instance and show you how one of those sources would be built. Let's go back to the main page just so that you guys can see how I get there. So remember, from the search screen, which is normally where you come into, you go under Manage, you go under Collection. Let's say that we had already installed a collector. In this case, we installed a hosted collector, and I want to add another source to this collector. So you just click on Add Source, and depending on what you choose here, that's the different options that you're going to be getting, the different screens. So if I were to choose an HTTP source, I would start having to specify the name, the description, the source host, source category. We're going to come to this in a little bit. This is very, very important. So we'll talk about source category in just a little bit. And then we'll talk about things like, do I want to enable timestamps parsing? What time zone should I be using? Should I use a time zone that the collector understands? Should pick it up from the file? Or should I ignore that time zone and use my specified time zone? What about timestamp format? Should I specify a format myself, or should I automatically detect one from the log file? Do I want to enable multi-line processing, meaning do I have messages that span multiple lines? And if so, how do I identify when a message begins and when a message ends? So I can specify the boundary regex in here as well. I can also specify processing rules. So in this particular case, I have 4 main rules that I can set up. I can decide to include certain messages that match a particular regex expression. I can exclude messages that match a particular regex expression. I can decide to hash messages that match, meaning replace a, say, credit card number with a unique number that I can continue to identify throughout my messages, or I can mask that number, that credit card number, with just pound signs or stars so that nobody can ever read that number, but I can't track it anymore individually. All right. Now, let me go back to the slide so that I can quickly show you, depending on which source you're doing. So for example, this is just a generic one showing you all the different fields that you have to enter. But if I am doing a remote file, then I'm going to be asked for things like the host, the port, the file, and so on. Username and password, of course, and my credentials. If I'm doing a syslog, then I'm going to be asked for the protocol. I'm going to be asked for the listening port. If I'm doing a Windows event collection source, then I'm going to be asked for the remote host names. I'm going to be asked for the Windows domain. I'm going to be asked for a username and password as well. If I am creating a Windows performance collection collector, then or source, I'm going to be asked again for the remote host, the window domain, how frequent should I be getting that data, the different perform queries that I might want to choose. If I'm doing a script, then of course the execution frequency, the command type, the path script. So again, depending on which source type you are doing, you're going to have different options for configuring that specific source. I'm going to just walk through these screens here quickly. I did talk a little bit about filtering. So like I mentioned before, you can filter data by excluding some data. You can just include certain data. You can hash the data. You can mask the data. And keep in mind that these filters affect only the data that is sent into Sumo Logic. So your logs on your end are going to remain intact. You're going to keep the entire file, but if you had an include filter, only those messages that you decided to include will make it into Sumo Logic. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. So a lot of people said, well, I've built like 6 or 7 different rules. Which ones take precedence over the other ones? So exclude filters are going to override all other types of filters, so those take priority. If you have one of each of these, the exclude filter is going to take priority over all of those. And then the mask and the hash filters are applied after the exclusion and the inclusion filters themselves. There's also the ability to do some blacklisting, so you can blacklist files or set of files that you shouldn't be ingesting into Sumo Logic. All right, so that's kind of the 30,000 foot view, or maybe in a little more detail, how to get collectors and how to get sources into the system. Now let's talk about metadata, and this is incredibly important because metadata is how you're going to be searching your data once it makes it into the system. So every single message that makes it into Sumo Logic is going to get tagged by at least these 5 different fields. And let me walk you through them. Let's take this example of our host in here. So the first thing is it's going to get tagged with a collector. This is just the name of the collector that that data came from. In this case, it's going to get tagged with collector A. Source is the name of the source that this data came through. So if it came from Apache Access or it came from Apache Error, it's going to get tagged with that source itself. Source host is the name of the server. So in this case, it's going to be host A. Source name is the name of the log file, including the path of where this data came from. So it's going to have the actual file name and path of where the Apache error message came from. And the last one is the important one I want to talk about, source category. This could be anything. You can make up anything that you want in here. Now, because you can make anything that you want, it could be a disaster if you don't choose the right thing, or it could be incredibly powerful if you choose the right thing in your source category. Let me give you some examples of what a good source category would be. Let's go back to this picture of our typical customer, as you're seeing here. And in this case, what I've done is I've added the source category for each one of the sources in here. So if you notice, my host A, which is my Apache Access data, now has a source category of WS, which stands for web server, so web server / Apache / access, and my Apache error has web server / Apache / error. So the host B is going to have the exact same one because it's the same kind of deal, and host C is going to have web server / IIS and web server IIS WC3. Why did we go this route? Let me show you some examples with this top right-hand corner searches that I can sample searches. So if I run a search that says source category equals WS Apache Access, this allows me to search this source, data coming from this source, and data coming from this source. Notice I did not have to say where collector equals host A and collector equals host B. I'm really able to skip all that and say, just give me anything that is WS Apache Access, and I can search across hosts, I can search across log files, I can search across even production and dev environment if I wanted to. I can run a search that says where source category equals WS Apache star. And in that particular case, I'm searching for everything in host A because it's going to include the Apache Access and the Apache error data. Or I can run a search where that says WS/star. And in that case, I'm going to be searching for data across all my different hosts, A, B, and C, because everything starts with WS. So you can start seeing that creating a source category that is pretty meaningful and that it has a convention that works for you is very, very important. Now, there is no one way of doing it. It's all going to depend on your type of data. So we do some recommendations, some source category naming convention best practices. What we recommend is you do something like component 1 / component 2 / component 3, where you're going from the least descriptive to the most descriptive, from general to very specific. Here's some examples for you to take a look at. So you could do something like networking / firewall / Cisco / FWSM, or networking / firewall Cisco ASA. So in this particular case, I'm going from networking specifically to the firewalls in my network, specifically to my Cisco firewalls, and then I go down to the device type within that is Cisco branded. The cool thing about this is I could do something like networking / firewall / Cisco / star, and I would be looking across these two different ones in here. The next one here is network firewall Palo Alto network, and then the device name, or networking router Cisco, and so on. So you're starting to get the point. What if I wanted all my Cisco data? Then I could say where source category equals networking / star / Cisco / star, and that would give me my firewall, my Cisco firewalls, my routers, my Cisco routers, and anything that is Cisco branded that I want that is under networking as well. All right, couple things. One is not all types of logs need to have the same amount of levels. It's up to you. You could have different levels. Just keep in mind that the levels are going to make it a lot easier for you to follow up. And then what are the benefits of coming up with a good source category naming convention? It's going to make your searches a lot easier to use. You're going to be able to make use of the wildcards as well. And then when you go into partitions, which is a little bit of a more advanced topic that you will you'll learn about later on, you'll be able to use this naming convention for creating your partitions or your indexes. And it's also going to make it a lot easier for your role-based access control rules. As I said, I'm going to share this deck with you, so there is some explanation here on what makes a good source category and some examples of some bad source categories. So if there's anything that you're taking from this webinar, is definitely go back. If you haven't started, think of what makes sense to have as a good naming convention for your source categories. And if you're just getting started, like about half of the people in this webinar, then definitely start thinking of how to implement a source category naming convention that is meaningful to your organization. And I've seen everything. I've seen people start with /prod versus /dev before they actually specify any of these other ones in here. So again, there is no one way of doing it. It all depends on what your data looks like. All right, just to complete this, I'm going to briefly walk through this, but there is some automating deployment options that are available for you. The first one is what we call silent installation, the ability to enter all your parameters into a file called sumo.conf, and in here you provide the name, you provide credentials, and you provide essentially all the initial setup that you need for the installation. So that's one way of setting up your collectors. The other way is using your local configuration collector management, and you notice that this deck has links. These links all point to the documentation with a lot more detail, so I'll share this with you. But this essentially allows you to manage the configuration locally using a JSON file with a tool like a Chef or a Puppet. Now, the cool thing about this option here is that you can, it's not just for initial setup, but you can do it for existing collectors as well. Once you start doing local file collector management, then you will no longer have the option to manage your collectors through, sorry, let me cancel out of this. You will no longer have the ability to manage your collectors through this screen in here. All these links will be disabled because you're now managing your collectors through the local configuration collector management. And the third way that you can do it is through the collector management API. Essentially, this allows you to define the initial source configuration and all your collectors using a JSON file. And there is an HTTP endpoint where you can retrieve and update your collector configuration. There is another webinar that we did specifically on collector on the API itself. So I'll point you to that as well so that you can get a little bit more detail. All right, last but not least, a few tips for your collectors. For one, there are some requirements. I misspelled it here, but there are some requirements to installing the collectors. I believe I actually even have that open, but there are some hardware requirements. They're not massive, but still that is something that you have to keep in mind when you are when you're setting up your collectors. There's some collector memory guidelines that we specify as well. So just keep that in mind if you're installing collectors. Some of the other things that you have to do for install collectors is that you have to specify access keys, so we can do that right, the proper handshake. The way to get your access keys in your environment is you can go into your preferences, and you have here the ability to create access keys so that you can install your collectors in there. And then last couple of things is for the collectors themselves. Generate logs. We see a lot of customers ingest those logs back into Sumo Logic as well. Those logs are found in your Sumo Home under logs, and then the current log itself is found under Sumo Home logs collector.logs. Things that you should keep in mind in here are things like out-of-memory errors, and we do have a post in the support site that talks a little bit about increasing memory and what you should do from that perspective in here. All right. So with that in mind, let me open it up to questions. I haven't seen anything yet on the screen in terms of questions, but this is your chance. Any questions from the audience? Okay. I'm seeing no questions, so perhaps I'm going to give you another few minutes to come up with questions if you have any. But in the meantime, I just wanted to put out there that there are some resources for you. For one, there is the documentation itself. If you haven't gotten to it yet, especially for those that are brand spanking new, if you go under help, you can go to documentation, and there is plenty of documentation here for you guys to be able to understand. It is context sensitive. I was just coming from the preferences page, so you notice that when I said help, it opened the preference page for me because that's where I am right now. If I go back to the search page and I go into documentation, it takes me to search query language, so it kind of understands it's context sensitive to send you to the right page. The other thing that I want to point you to, if for those of you that are new to Sumo Logic, is this Sumo Logic training page. So sumologic.com/training. There are some public instructor-led courses like the one that you're attending right now, but there's also a lot of online self-paced training. So if you're brand spanking new, I would suggest you go through these. These are 3 to 4 minute videos, and it walks you how to get your data, how to search, how to parse, how to create dashboards. But also, more interesting for everybody on this call, there's a video library. And if you haven't seen it, definitely go into here, and this is going to give you, this is where we keep all the recordings for all the webinars that we run. The quick start webinar to get it started, but also things like how do you analyze the data, how do you use log reduce, how do you use livetail. So a little bit of more information there for you to see. Also, we have launched a community. It's called Sumo Dojo, and you can go into the dojo and look at posts that already exist. You can respond to posts, you can search posts, you can enter your own posts and get questions answered. You can vote for feature requests as well. If you haven't done that, you can, from our instance in here under help, you can request a feature, or you can open a support ticket as well. So quite a few things here for you guys to continue your journey with Sumo Logic, and we certainly hope that this has been helpful for you guys. And if there are no questions, I will probably wrap it up right now, and thank you all for your time. You will be receiving an email from me with a recording as well as the slides for this session. Thank you.